Welcome to Recap King. In this video, we will explain The Intruder. This movie tells the story of a newlywed who moves into a new house after their wedding. Soon enough, they discover that the man they bought the property from is keeping a close watch on them. Will they escape from the intruder's terror? Let's find out in The Intruder. The Intruder begins with the birthday party of Scott, a successful young marketer who lives in the city of San Francisco. The birthday celebration was attended by many friends and colleagues. Annie expressed her desire to have a home and children. Scott loves Annie so much that he is willing to work on a house in the countryside even though he works in a big city. So the two of them set off on a trip to Napa Valley, a suburb far from the hustle and bustle of the big city, and started looking for the house they saw advertised for sale. They arrived at an old house filled with a large yard. It could be seen from Annie's facial expression that she really liked the house. This house looks perfect in Annie's eyes. This is the place Annie wants to raise her children in the future. When they got to the house, Scott and Annie tried to find the house owner, but they couldn't find him. So the two decided to go around for a while to the yard behind the house. There, Annie found a cute deer, but to her surprise, a man with a gun appeared and shot the deer right in front of Scott and Annie. Both of them were so scared. But it turns out that this man is Charlie, the house owner who wants to sell his house. Charlie ends up taking Scott and Annie around to see the house. Charlie said that he had lived in the house for a long time, even since his great-grandfather. Inside the house, Charlie looked at Annie several times, and it was clear that this middle-aged man was very interested in Annie. Charlie said if his wife died of cancer and his daughter, Cassidy, asked him to move to Florida and live with him. That was the reason why he wanted to sell the house that held these memories. A painting in the living room caught Scott's attention. He did not like the painting that looked old and outdated. Charlie looked so admiring his own house. From all the words expressed, it was clear that Charlie still loved his house even though he had to sell it. As they passed the aisle above, they were introduced to a cupboard where towels and toiletries were stored. After making an offer, Charlie reveals that he just wants to sell his house at the desired price. After Scott and Annie were about to leave, Charlie finally changed his mind and gave the house to them, albeit with a very forced expression. Scott bought the house and made Annie so happy, even though they didn't know it was a very wrong decision. Charlie gives the house keys and bids farewell to both as he is going to Florida to meet his daughter. The next day, Scott and Annie invited their friend Mike and his girlfriend to come and have dinner together. They looked so happy enjoying the night. Mike then went out to pee in the yard. He's also smoking. But oddly enough, Mike could sense that someone was staring at him from a distance. After he finished peeing, he threw his cigarette butt in the yard and left. The next day, Mike was shocked and angry when he found a hole in the seat of his luxury car. He was so sure someone had punched holes in his car because he had never smoked in a car. While working in his office, Scott gets a call from Annie saying that Charlie is in their yard and busy mowing the lawn. When asked by Annie, Charlie only explained that he couldn't stand the sight of lawn and unkempt grass, so he took the initiative to mow the grass. Charlie admitted that he was currently staying at a hotel in the middle of the city while waiting to move to Florida. Because of his very kind nature, Annie even invited Charlie to come to the Thanksgiving dinner because she felt sorry for Charlie, who was away from the family. Thanksgiving Day arrived, and Charlie came with a lot of enthusiasm with a cake. While at his house, Scott takes Charlie on a tour of the house he's renovated. When they got to the living room, Charlie looked so displeased that Scott had replaced an old painting in the living room. Charlie says that the painting was his gift to Scott, and he is not happy that Scott changed it. While enjoying the Thanksgiving meal, they all joked and talked a lot. Mike and his partner also came, and he continued to advise Scott to renovate the entire house. According to him, this house is too old and the model is outdated. He even suggested demolishing some of the walls and replacing them with a more modern design. Strangely, Charlie's face looks increasingly displeased and looks angry even though the house is no longer his. When he was smoking outside the house, Mike was again visited by Charlie, who looked displeased because he was smoking in his yard. When Charlie left, Mike was sure that Charlie was the one who stuck the cigarette butt in the seat of his luxury car, but Annie couldn't believe it and believed that Charlie was a good person. So that night, Scott and Mike try to find where Charlie is. They went out of the house with flashlights, and what they found on the forest road near his house was shocking. They saw a parked car and were sure it belonged to Charlie, but the car soon sped away. Mike was convinced that Charlie was still not ready to give up his house, and he was still around their house. The next day, Scott installed a burglar detector in his home. While the workers were installing some burglar sensors on the tree, Charlie came back and was angry because he didn't like the workers destroying the tree. Scott said he installed a burglar detector because someone was near his neighborhood. Charlie said they were just high school kids partying in the woods next to his house. Charlie suggests that Scott use a gun if he wants to protect his family, but Scott is traumatized by a gun and says he will never use a gun in his home. This is because when he was only 12 years old, his brother was shot in the street and died. At nightfall, Scott wakes up to a sound, then his burglar light indicates someone is approaching his property. Scott immediately ran out of the house with a baseball bat. It turns out that what Charlie said is true if there are high school children who often gather in the forest next to his house to hang out. But when a car's headlights passed and shone on it, Scott didn't realize Charlie was hiding among the trees in the dark. The next day, Scott and Annie came home with a Christmas tree, and how upset Scott was when he found Charlie still in their neighborhood. This time Scott couldn't stand the presence of Charlie, who was still bothering them. Charlie then showed him the Christmas ornaments he had stored in the warehouse. Scott shows disdain for Charlie, but Annie does the opposite. Annie had a feeling that Charlie only wanted to do good by helping them find the tools he had kept all this time. Scott finally asked Annie to never allow Charlie into their yard again because he thought Charlie was behaving like the house still belonged to him. At the office, Scott began to get close to his manager and he was invited to join the bar for a drink. Meanwhile, Charlie returns to Annie's house with a bottle of wine as an apology for causing a ruckus yesterday. Charlie offers to help put up the Christmas decorations because Scott is too busy working. That night, Annie allowed Charlie to come into the house and drink the wine that Charlie brought while talking. Annie then gets a text from Scott saying that he will be home late, and Annie was so mad that Scott was always calling when he was coming home late, and if he was just texting, it meant Scott was with another woman. Meanwhile, Scott is at the bar with the manager, trying to flirt with him. Finally, after an argument on the phone, Scott decided to go home. And when he got home, he was so surprised because there was an empty wine bottle left on the table. Especially, he was confused about how Annie could put up all the Christmas decorations alone. The two then got into an argument until that night Annie slept alone in the bedroom while Scott slept in the living room. It was raining heavily that night, and Scott woke up to a sound like someone was in their house. Unfortunately, he couldn't find anyone. Annie came over to Scott, and the two apologized to each other. But when the two were making out, Charlie was peeking at them from inside the house without them knowing. So how did Charlie get into this house? The next day, while buying a drink at a cafe in the middle of the city, Scott met a man who said he lived not far from his house. The man told him he had to be careful with Charlie. According to him, Charlie's wife died in that house. It turns out that Charlie's wife was found to have committed suicide by firing a rifle into her mouth. Hearing this, Scott and Annie immediately checked the room where Charlie's wife used to live. They could find streaks of blood stuck to the walls, but Annie repeatedly denied it, and there was no way a man like Charlie would kill his wife. That night, Scott goes to the Royal Hotel and looks for Charlie. Scott reminds Charlie to stay away from his wife and home while bluffing. The next scene shows when Charlie is so angry that Scott is humiliated in a public place. The following day, Scott decides to take a morning jog through the deserted streets while listening to music, but he was hit by a speeding car until Scott rolled over and fell into a ravine. Admitted to the hospital, Annie was told that Scott is okay, but they had done an examination, and the results would be out tomorrow. That meant Scott had to stay in the hospital that night. Scott asks Annie to come home, but Scott had a bad feeling that it was likely that Charlie had run into him, so he called Mike and asked him to check Charlie's background. At home alone, Annie, who was taking a shower, was startled by the doorbell ringing. It turned out that on the doorstep, Charlie had come back to visit again. Charlie came with the excuse of being sorry for what happened to Scott. He brought pizza for Annie. Charlie was about to leave, but Annie finally invited Charlie to come into the house and accompany her to eat. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Mike gets a lot of information about Charlie. The most surprising thing is that Charlie lies about many things, especially his intention to go to Florida. Charlie's goal is to sell his house because he's in a job with a lot of debt. Scott finally asks Mike for help to check on Annie at his house. When Mike arrived at Scott and Annie's house, he felt strange because he saw Charlie in Scott's house chatting with Annie. While peeking from a distance, Charlie accidentally sees Mike, and his plan to get rid of Mike immediately appears. Charlie says the party-loving high school kids are back, and he wants to kick them out. Charlie immediately came out and chased after Mike with an axe. Mike, who was so tensed, stopped by Charlie. But Charlie wasn't going to let Mike off the hook this time. With the axe in his hand, he plunged straight into his chest and killed him. Back at home, Charlie seemed unable to resist the desire to fondle Annie, but in the end, he left. The next day, Charlie returned to his house and peeked at Annie in the shower. It was clear he could access his house so easily. Finally, Scott comes home and is angry that Charlie is still hanging around in his yard. Here we can see Charlie coming out of a small hut in the yard. Scott panicked when Annie told him that Mike never got home. For days, Scott tried to find Mike, but he couldn't find him anywhere. Finally, with the help of his office mates, Scott managed to find traces of Cassidy, Charlie's daughter. But Cassidy refused to answer Scott's phone, and she looked so panicked when Scott talked about her father. Upon returning from shopping, Annie is surprised by Charlie's presence at her house. Charlie wanted to say that he wanted to see Annie alone and wanted to talk to each other. That's when Annie realized that something was wrong with Charlie. She was so scared and tried to ask Charlie to come out. After Charlie left, Annie immediately locked all the doors and windows of the house, but she heard a voice from behind the cupboard where the towels were stored on the second floor. Unexpectedly, behind the cupboard, there is a secret door. When Annie entered the room, she fell, and she found a secret room tucked away behind her wardrobe. When the light was turned on, how surprised she was to find a bed and various kitchen utensils there, as if someone had lived in the room for a long time. This room is connected by a long hallway filled with cobwebs. The end of this hallway is a small hut located in her yard. Annie could see Charlie looking in the mirror in his car as if he wanted to look stunning in front of Annie. Unfortunately, Annie's whereabouts were discovered by Charlie, who immediately chased her down the narrow alley. When Annie opened the wrong door, she was so shocked to find Mike's body lying rigidly stored in a refrigerator. Annie quickly calls Scott, but Charlie arrives earlier and tries to rape her. Annie was hit by Charlie until she passed out. On the way home, Cassidy, Charlie's daughter, calls Scott and explains that her mother did not kill herself but was killed by her father. Cassidy had changed her identity by this time, and she was trying to escape to avoid Charlie. Scott knew his wife was in danger, so he rushed home. Meanwhile, Charlie was trying to rape Annie in her bed. Scott made it home, and he knew something was wrong with his wife. When Scott tries to reach his room, he is attacked by Charlie, who immediately beats him several times. Scott and Charlie duel until Scott falls from the second floor and almost faints. Annie, who was hiding in the room, was chased until she was captured again by Charlie. The two of them duel until Scott manages to beat Charlie multiple times. Quickly, Annie stabbed a knife that Charlie was carrying right at her back, but neither of them survived because Charlie had now come down to his hiding room and started taking his rifle. The scene continues as if it were a game of hide and seek where Charlie repeatedly fired at the corners of the house blindly until the house was pitch black. Scott and Annie hid behind the bedroom door. With the guns so close, Charlie could shoot them any time. Charlie finally entered the room where Scott and Annie had been hiding, and Scott finally appeared from behind the door and hit Charlie in the face with a baseball bat. Charlie lay there, dying. Scott will not let Charlie live any longer and terrorize his family. Annie immediately called the police and said that her husband had just shot an intruder. And this is the end of Charlie's life when a bullet goes straight through his head. The film ends.